I live in an apartment downtown in a small city. There's plenty of activity during the day, but at night the city basically goes dead. I like to go on late-night walks because I enjoy the peace and quiet, and being a 210-pound, 6-foot male, I know people probably aren't going to mess with me. A couple of weeks ago, I was walking a big loop around the downtown area at 11 p.m. Midway through my walk, I noticed two figures on the street to my left walking parallel with me. I couldn't really make them out, but they had the build of two men. They weren't doing anything suspicious, so I figured I probably just noticed them because they were the only other people out at this hour. I continued walking down the street and saw them between buildings and trees, still walking in parallel with me. I felt uneasy, even though I had no good reason to be. Finally, I had to turn to loop back around, so I basically leapfrogged their street and started walking back on the street to the other side of them. As I passed them, they wouldn't have been able to know I had changed direction until about this point. They stopped walking, and I could hear them talking to each other in excited but hushed voices. You know that feeling so many people experience when they feel like they're being watched? I definitely felt like that. I never have before. It was tangible. I absolutely knew that these two guys were talking about me. I was amazed at how strongly I felt a sense of danger with absolutely no clear evidence of it. The subconscious is a very powerful thing. I continued on through the intersection and past a building that obstructed my view of them. I thought about starting to run at this point, but I went against my instincts, told myself I was being ridiculous, and just kept walking. If you find yourself in a situation where your subconscious is yelling at you like this, listen to it. Don't be an idiot like me. I was about halfway down the block when I heard quick footsteps around the corner behind me. I looked over my shoulder, and of course it was them walking hurriedly towards me. My whole body tightened up as I felt the fight-or-flight mode coming on. I had no weapons of any kind on me, and I would not have been able to take on these two guys by myself. The only thing I had on me was my phone, so I took it out and began dialing my brother, who I figured could at least call the police if something happened. The instant I started dialing, I heard the footsteps behind me go from walking to running. I thought to myself, well, you're surely fucked now. So I put on my best poker face, turned around, planted my feet, and stared directly at these two assholes with my phone up to my ear. What happened next was really weird. They slowed to a jog when I turned around. One of the guys just jogged right on past me without even making eye contact or saying anything. The other came up to me and said, "Sup, man?" patted me on the shoulder, and kept jogging. I turned around and watched them go, slightly dumbfounded at what just happened. I hear, "Hello? You there?" And my attention snapped back to my phone. I was holding up to my ear, with my brother on the line. Then the weirdest part of it all happened. I was crossing the street to go back to my apartment while explaining the bizarre experience to my brother, and I happened to look down the alleyway of the street up ahead. The two guys were in the alleyway next to the street I was walking on, hidden and facing the street. I booked it the fuck out of there before they could see me and went right back to my apartment. I have no idea what those guys wanted. I didn't find out until the next day that there was a stabbing right near where I was, but I have no idea if it was related. Either way, I'd prefer not to meet those assholes again. I once dated a stalker. However, what makes this story unusual is that she wasn't stalking me, although it ended up becoming my problem, as you'll see. Even though I wasn't the victim of her stalking, I didn't necessarily have a great relationship with her either. I met this girl, let's call her Annie, on a forum devoted to a video game we all loved. There were discussions about the game and some light roleplay. This was about a decade ago, and I was young, stupid, and had some problems that led to other poor decisions in my life. But that's another story entirely. And had just ended my first serious relationship, which due to this ex's bipolar disorder would have been an emotional roller coaster for anyone. Online, Annie was as sweet as could be, and was especially sympathetic about what had happened to my last relationship, claiming she had just gotten out of a chaotic relationship herself. We talked a lot, and I thought, jokingly suggested getting together. Eventually, a major anime convention on the East Coast rolled around, and many members of the forum were attending, including myself, Annie, and the other person in the story, who I'll call Ron. I'd spoken to Ron a bit before the convention, on the forum and AIM, and hadn't particularly liked him, but I didn't hate him either. He just seemed pretty standoffish and had a short temper. While he could be fun to talk to sometimes, I had to make sure to only talk about the sorts of things we would on the forum, as you never knew what would set him off, and some pretty random things did, like mentioning other forums I frequented or other interests I had. The convention came, and Annie, Ron, and I all met in person for the first time, as well as some other members of the forum. I was there with another group, including my best friend, and had stated beforehand that I'd be spending most of my time with them, but that I'd try to hang out with them when I could for photo ops and the like, since we were all cosplaying characters from the game the forum was devoted to. However, upon meeting Annie, she immediately latched onto me, going on about how I was much cuter than she had expected. She had seen pics of me before, and that I was even sweeter in person than online. In hindsight, I can see she was playing on the vulnerabilities she knew I had, but at the time I was immediately smitten. As a result, I spent most of the convention with her, which didn't sit well with the group I had come with, and it took a long time and a lot of damage control to repair my relationships with them. I also spent a lot of time with Ron, who ended up being nastier in person than he was online. But for some reason, Annie adored him. Again, 20/20 hindsight, I think she thought that by fawning over me, she'd make him jealous. But he wasn't interested in the first place, so it didn't work. The fact that I was female might have also thrown him off to her intentions. The weekend came to an end. Near the end of it, Ron was removed by security and banned from ever attending again after he beat the crap out of a girl who had tried to hug him. Random hugging is a strange, not entirely welcome reality of anime conventions. She had declined to press charges since he had asked her not to hug him, so she took part of the blame. With Ron out of the way now, Annie turned her focus entirely to me, or so I thought. By the end of the weekend, Annie had declared herself my girlfriend. You know how people talk about red flags? Annie might as well have been a living red flag. She called the shots throughout our short relationship, and when I say that, I mean I literally had no say in anything. She told me what our relationship status was, and she told me when we were going to go out. Within days of that, she told me we were engaged. Because she lived in Ohio and I lived in Maine, and she refused to move for me, and maybe she didn't realize just what a vulnerable, stupid doormat I was, she demanded I move to Ohio. I didn't move, but I had begun making plans to do so, when she abruptly told me, "This is all happening too fast. We're over." Well, no shit, it was moving too fast. In the span of a week, we went from dating to engaged, and same-sex marriage wasn't even legal in either of our states at the time, let alone nationwide. And in less than 2 months, it was over. It was a wild ride, to say the least, and although I was upset at first when it ended, when I was in a better place mentally and emotionally, I was just immensely relieved to have her out of my life, or so I thought. The sign of things to come was when Annie admitted to me that the relationship with her girlfriend back home that she had claimed had ended badly actually hadn't ended at all. But she totally intended to break it off before I got to Ohio. Shortly after that was our breakup, and then I started to get messages and calls from Ron. Apparently, Although Annie was posting publicly everywhere on various social medias her relationship status with me, she was actually bombarding him with instant messages, texts, and phone calls, professing her love to him, and promising that she would drop me in a hot minute if he gave the word. He repeatedly told her he wasn't interested, blocked her on AIM, blocked her number, and obviously left the forum. Ron messaged and called me to inform me of this. Although I told him repeatedly we had already broken up, he seemed to believe Annie's behavior was my fault, and that it was my job to rein her in, although he never came out and told me so. I think Annie was telling him lies about me, as I later found out he was trash-talking me elsewhere. Somehow this convinced him that I was somehow responsible for Annie's stalking, and that I could put a kibosh on the whole thing if I wanted to. I repeatedly told him we had already broken up. We weren't even speaking anymore, and if she was posing a serious problem, to call the cops. So here I am with Annie stalking Ron blaming me for stalking, while semi-stalking me. For one thing, I never gave him my phone number, and he started calling me after I blocked him on AIM, and I have no idea how to get out of any of this. Annie eventually moved to the state that Ron lived in. Whether she dumped her girlfriend in Ohio, I don't know, and started running into him in public places. She followed him home and would try to visit, insisting that she wasn't pursuing him. They were just friends. He told her to fuck off in no uncertain terms, but undeterred, Annie still kept coming to his house, sometimes when he wasn't there, and Ron was still somehow convinced this was all my fault, so it was my responsibility to fix it. I changed my number eventually, as well as my online presence, so that he wouldn't be able to find me on social media or the like. I really don't know how things ended with Ron and Annie. As I said, I eventually, about 2 years later, found Ron trash-talking me elsewhere, but it was for reasons unrelated to Annie, although he was saying things that weren't true, and I'm sure Annie had told him. For 2 years, this guy carried a grudge against me because of my brief association with a crazy girl who was fixated on him. About a decade later, I've seen no signs of Ron or Annie anywhere online. I even went to the convention again the year after I met Annie, and although I had some issues regarding another relationship while there, and yes, by then I had come to the conclusion the problems I was having with the relationships were due to me, and stopped dating, I never saw Ron, who was, as I said, banned for life, or Annie, who lived in the area now, in order to stalk Ron. So, Ron, while I hope the stalking thing ended peacefully, and nothing happened to you, and Annie, let's not meet ever again. When I was young, I was placed into a PRU unit. These are small buildings in England that house children with mental, physical, and behavioral difficulties, as well as children from care homes. The PRU was located in the industrial warehouse section of the city, so it was very isolated and difficult to find for most people. At 13, my mother trusted me enough to start walking. You had to walk through my estate, walk on a canal, and then walk over a bridge, then an abandoned road, and cross a highway, and then walk through a bus lane. The abandoned road had greenhouses toward the middle and several bushes, and a small lane 3 feet below the first lane, hidden from view. I rarely saw people on that road, and when I did, it was every few weeks, and it was usually just a person walking their dog. I had an uncomfortable experience on this road a month prior, so I kept my head down mostly. One day I saw a younger guy. I found out later he was 15, but he looked a lot older. He was about 6'3", broad shoulders, in general just a big guy. He smiled at me when we were near the greenhouses, and I smiled back, and after we passed, I heard him shouting behind me. I removed my earphones and turned around, and we started walking towards each other. He called me gorgeous and asked for my name. Flattered was not the term I'd use, but I appreciated the comment and started talking to him. Despite being incredibly naive and quite stupid, even I knew not to talk to random people on the street. He recognized me and introduced himself, saying he used to go to my school, but was in the other classes. He mentioned a couple of our teachers, and I was put at ease. A very important thing you should know about these PRU units is most of the kids had no social skills and had been segregated from normal society. We also nearly all had terrible or not involved parents, so school was the only time we experienced contact with others. I was the only girl in my class for almost 2 years, and also one of the youngest, and most of the boys had no boundaries. Not a single topic was ever forbidden, and our school encouraged to always smile, always be very kind and polite kind of attitude. If we did not smile or did not engage, we were warned. If we reacted unpleasantly, it was also not well liked. Within literally moments of us talking, he was asking me questions. Do you have a boyfriend? Have you ever had sex? Do you like this position? Do you shave like this? Now, by that point, I was getting kind of uncomfortable, but it had been drummed into me to accept everyone, and hey, he was from my school, so I kind of just answered and changed the subject. He kept looking at my chest and giving me the once-over. He asked me to meet him at 1 p.m. after school, which I agreed to. He gave me a hug and walked away. I was a little weary of him. I'd heard all kinds of jokes in class, but none of the boys had ever been direct with me. I wasn't used to being treated like a girl. I got into class and I asked one of the teachers about him. She said he was okay and was surprised he'd talk to me, since he was shy. She encouraged me to see him. Another teacher also mentioned him, saying he was okay, so I decided I would. They did mention that if you were a girl, he'd ask you out to date at least once, so just be warned. We finished school early. He just snuck out of school to come and meet me near the greenhouses. He seemed a little put out that I was still wearing my school uniform and a jumper. The questions started again, but this time it felt different. They were even more personal. I started feeling uncomfortable, but I didn't know what to do. He could tell I was nervous, and looking back, I think he liked that. At one point, I turned away from him to carry on walking, and he grabbed my hips and lifted me up, which freaked me out. I turned to face him and gave him a petrified expression. He asked me about kissing, and I said I wasn't interested. He leaned over me and took hold of my shoulders and put his tongue in my mouth. I pushed him back and started feeling freaked out again. Once again, I was really naive and was not good at expressing how I felt because it was not allowed. I said I wanted to go. He said he wanted me to stay for another 15 minutes or so and begged me to stay. He kept me talking, and as we walked, he led me towards the lower lane beside the greenhouses. The conversations were very straightforward, and I was so involved in them. I just never noticed where exactly we were walking. He then asked me to perform sex acts on him. I refused repeatedly. He asked me to have sex with him, and I said no. He got whiny and sat down, and I felt awkward. I started looking at the path away from him, then looking at him, and he just gave me a weird, knowing look. By that point, I started feeling scared. Like a stupid kid, I went over and hugged him, figuring if I came across nice and stayed for the next 3 minutes, he'd say goodbye. He grabbed my backside and I jumped back and said shakily I wanted to go. He said he'd let me go if I performed the act. He'd even lead me deeper into the forest so no one would see. I refused a few times, and he kept watching me closely and moved in front of the small path, blocking me. He asked if I wanted to see him exposed. I said no. He asked me another couple times, and I refused. Either way, he ended up flashing me. He smiled when I looked at him in horror. I started crying by this point. I felt terrified. He said I could go, and I walked past him, and as I was about to go back onto the abandoned road, he shouted at me. When I turned back, he was still exposed and smiling, waving at me. The next day on my way to school, I noticed something moving in the bushes. It was winter, so I didn't pay much attention, but as I got closer, I noticed him looking at me. I walked to the other side of the road and carried on walking. He shouted at me, and I turned around, and he was flashing me, asking me if I liked it. When I got to school, I brought it up, saying I felt scared and I didn't know why. Had I done something wrong? They told me that any girl he talked to, he asked to date. He looked at all the girls, and you couldn't let him sit beside the girls on the classroom couches because he'd end up cuddling them or touching them. He himself told me he used to put his hand up girls' skirts under the table during class. He was removed from the PRU unit a year or so before due to behavioral issues. I saw him over a year later. He'd lost a ton of weight and was standing at a classroom window watching me. I think one of the teachers ended up going outside and telling him to leave. I've not seen him since, and I'd love for it to stay that way. When I was 11, I had a very disturbing encounter with a plain white van. To preface this a little better, I lived on the outskirts of a small town in Texas. Now I live in town. My only friend that lived anywhere near me was a childhood friend who had since moved. However, I had developed a friendship with her aunt, a substitute teacher that worked at my school. It was not uncommon for me to visit her aunt, about 1.5 miles up a major highway. It's a state highway running north to south with a lot of traffic. I would occasionally, on a whim, go out on a bike. While biking to her house one day, I noticed a van behind me get on the shoulder with their blinker on behind me, as if to turn down her road, as it was the only one for a good 1/4 mile on the right. Knowing that there were a few more houses down the road, I didn't think anything of it. It followed me up the road as I turned down it, but instead of turning, it parked perpendicular to the road, as if blocking it. Feeling something was wrong, I hastened to her door, her trailer being the first house in plain view of the road. Eyeing the van, I ran to her front door and began knocking. The van sat there, unmoving, with tinted windows. I knocked again, constantly looking between the door and the van. A good minute or two had passed, and I begun knocking very loudly, banging in desperation. She had to be home. Her car was there. I looked over at the van and began to see the passenger side door facing me slowly begin to open. At the next moment, my friend's aunt opened the door and asked me what's wrong. Before explaining anything, I glanced back at the van. The door that was opening slammed shut and the van took off. After explaining everything and taking a moment to calm down, she took me and my bike home. I explained the entire thing to my grandmother, who was more than a little worried. I never saw that exact van again. Since that day, I still feel very uncomfortable around unmarked white vans, and am weary of any car that looks as if it may be tailing me. I can never be sure of their intentions, but to this day, I feel like I narrowly avoided being kidnapped that day. I'm a karaoke DJ. I usually get home between 2 and 3 a.m., but tonight I got off around 11 because the bar had a power outage. I live alone in a triplex behind a house. I live in the middle of a city, but the property I'm on is rather large, so there's a big backyard behind my apartment. As I was coming home tonight, I noticed that my cats weren't waiting for me in the window. They can hear my van pulling in the driveway. They are in the window every night, no exception. I thought it was odd. Then I noticed that my kitchen light was on. I never leave my kitchen light on. At this point, I was a little freaked out. That's when I thought I saw movement in my kitchen. I called 911 and the dispatcher told me to lock my van doors and remain in the vehicle and stay on the line. The officers showed up very quickly, less than 5 minutes. They parked on the street and walked up to my van, They asked me to stay quiet and give them my house key. One officer went to the back of my apartment, and the other used my key to unlock the door. When he opened the door, all was quiet. Then he yelled really loud, telling someone to come out. I heard the police officer that was in my backyard start yelling, and the other officer ran out to join him. My neighbors had come outside at this point, and I was freaking out. It seemed like a long time, but they walked a cuffed woman towards me, and it turns out it was a patron that I had 86 this last weekend. I don't know how she found out where I lived. She was hiding in my bedroom closet with a very large knife and a bundle of rope. I don't want to think about what would have happened had I gone to bed with her waiting for me. I will be taking a gun safety course soon, but really before I found this sub, I wouldn't have noticed all of the little things that were out of the ordinary tonight. Reading these events have taught me to be more observant. So, drunk idiot that thought she was going to shank me. Let's not meet.